Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining another episode of the Educational Leadership Podcast. We have another very special guest. Before we introduce our guest, we want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Ideal Impact. Ideal Impact is giving hundreds of millions of dollars in funding to school districts around the great state of Texas at no out-of-pocket expense to the district, and there's a guarantee associated with it. Well, thank you, Ideal Impact, for sponsoring our podcast. And let's start with our guests. And before we introduce our guests, we want to introduce our co-host, Corinne French.
Oh, so glad to be here again today, Gary, and cannot wait to get started with our guest today.
Yeah, and it's so cool when we bring different guests on, the connections we find. So we found an interesting connection between Corinne and Superintendent Novotny from Salado ISD. Superintendent Novotny, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, before we get into our conversation, tell us a little bit about your background.
So I grew up in Minnesota, lived up there 24 years, and so 24 winters was enough for me, and made the move south to Texas, and went to the University of North Texas there to earn my second master's and my doctorate. I was 12 years in the Plano School District, then 3 years in the Moulton School District, and now this is my 12th year in the Salado School District here in Texas.
Love that. Shout out to University of North Texas. Next time you're up on campus, you'll have to come say hi to me. Go Mean Green.
Go Mean Green. That's right.
And I love that you said 24 winters was enough. I am from Northeastern Ohio, and it is absolutely unnecessary ever to be cold again on for any reason other than if you're going skiing or sled riding or ice skating. But who wants to live in that? So welcome to Texas. We're glad that you're with us. And I love that you said your background, Plano ISD, but I'd love to know what brought you to education.
You know, it was my 7th grade math teacher, John Larson, who that year in 7th grade, it was his first year of teaching. And I just really connected with him, and he's been a lifelong friend and mentor for me. He actually went on to become the Minnesota Teacher of the Year for the whole state before he retired a couple of years ago. And then my father, who was a teacher for 35 years, and a cross-country and track coach that I had in high school as well. Those are probably the 3 that really impacted me the most and led me into education.
Well, we have another connection. The only sport that I understand is cross-country.
Oh, that's great.
Yes, I ran cross country. I think that's such a mind sport. You have to be, you have to get that in your head to do that. Not that I was great, but I finished the races. Well, what's on your mind today? I know Gary usually starts with introduction questions, and I'm going to go for it, Gary.
Oh, go for it. Go for it.
What's on your mind today when you're thinking of public ed and what's happening in public ed and all the things that are in the news and the things we've been through in the last couple of years? What's on your mind and your heart? On your mind and your heart?
For me, with the upcoming legislative session, it really would be school funding. And in particular for my school district, that has been the greatest challenge in the last 12 years I've been here is school funding. Because unfortunately, my district is funded less than any district in the Central Texas area and one of the very lowest funded districts in the state. And so I always feel like I'm trying to provide a Cadillac education on a Chevrolet budget. And nothing against Chevrolet owners, because I drive Chevrolets myself, but I always feel like that's their greatest challenge, is trying to maintain adequate staffing, competitive salaries, facilities, curriculum, everything for kids. When we just, I could give you some statistics if you're interested, but we are very low per student funding compared to other districts. And with the legislative session coming up, there's a huge surplus in the state budget that they could use to help districts across the state. And I hope they do, but I know a big competitor for that is going to be, reducing property taxes. That's, I know, a big priority as well for the legislature. So, but I just hope there's some balance there, that I'm all for paying less taxes as well, but I hope they also keep some money set aside for increasing education funding as well, particularly with how the economy and cost of living and inflation has affected us, and trying to compete for employees with other entities, businesses and corporations, and that as well.
That is such a great topic, because we had another superintendent on the podcast recently. We're just talking about funding as it relates to teachers, and it's often overlooked on some of the necessities that are needed, especially with a short staff of teachers. But I'm just curious, what is y'all's big initiative to where, let's say, if you got another couple $1 million, what would that go towards, you think?
Teacher salaries, yeah, mainly to teacher salaries for sure, and more teaching positions to keep class sizes manageable as we continue to grow as a district. But those would be the main priorities: is teacher salaries and just salaries for all our employees to maintain competitive salaries for our employees.
Tell us about something that you're doing interesting or unique. I think that when we think of funding, I always think that people don't often understand Texas public school funding and the finance. They don't quite understand it. And they think, well, if there's something wrong, you can just get more money from the state. And so are there ways that you've been able to do creative things, because the local control is important, and how you have control over the funding that comes into your district, or what part of it that you have control over? Are there unique ways that you've been able to meet some of the needs in the last? And we didn't tell you this question ahead of time, so we're not asking. I feel like our guests need to know that we don't. These are organic conversations, and so I didn't really give you a go ahead that I was going to ask this question, but I'm always interested in that. How local districts make things work. And I think there's got to be something special that you're doing to keep it going.
So the biggest is just trying to maintain competitive salaries. And we use a comparison through TASB, the Texas Association of School Boards. They do a salary study of all the districts statewide. And so we do a comparison of mid-sized districts, which are from 1,600 to 5,000 kids in the state. And we try to match those salaries every year, which again is a challenge because our per student funding is averaging at $8,900 per student, but I could list some other districts around us in Central Texas of similar size that are anywhere from $9,459 up to all the way up to $11,895. And so it's literally per year based on enrollment, we could be getting between 1.2 to $6.9 million more per year compared to these other dozen districts in the area. And the state average being $10,811 per student, and we're $4.4 million per year below the state average, of all the districts in the state. And so, but we, in spite of all that challenge, we maintain the highest salaries of the mid-sized districts in Central Texas. Our average teacher salaries are $53,733 or 773 compared to the other districts range from 53,494 to 48,759. So that's, we really try to prioritize teacher compensation to maintain those salaries to be competitive. But beyond that, we did do a $1,000 employee retention incentive this year in September, so that any employees that came back this year, we gave them $1,000. And then on top of that, for bus drivers in particular, that's the area we've have the hardest time recruiting and retaining staff. We've done hiring incentives and retention incentives for them as well. In fact, on that note, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, I'm driving bus routes as a superintendent because we're that short of drivers. But the one thing we're looking at doing for next year actually is instead of a retention incentive, doing an attendance incentive to try to prioritize employee attendance. And so if we can fit it in the budget for next year, we're going to do $1,000, and any employee that does not miss a day of work during the school year would get the $1,000. And then every day you miss, it'd be $100 off of that. So if you miss one day, you'd get 900. 2 days, you'd miss, get 800. Because the other area we've really been shorthanded is with substitute teachers. Right. And so if we can increase our employee attendance rate, that will reduce the number of subs we need and save us money on the subs as well.
Congratulations on that. I mean, those are good. Those are like those numbers and comparative numbers are important. When you mentioned that per student funding, can you explain something to our guests? There are guests who listen who are trustees all across the state. Some of my friends that were serving with me in different parts of the state. I'm sure we have people who are just our friends, Gary's friends, and my friends that might listen. I'm not sure our spouses listen enough. Gary, we'll have to talk about that later if our spouses listen to this. But what, and again, this is a question that just made me think, and I'm a lifelong learner in this area. So what is the difference if you have 8,000 per pupil, that's a lot, versus like 10,000? What kind of things can be done different? I mean, tell the average person, what kind of things can you do for a student when you get 2,000 more per student, or 4,000?
Sure. Yeah, certainly the amount of staff you can hire, the salaries you can provide those staff, facilities, curriculum, safety initiatives, all sorts of things, extracurricular activities, all sorts of things, could be improved with additional funding. And part of the difference, part of the reason we're my district's funded at such a low level compared to other districts is because of student demographics. It's without going into great detail in a 20-minute podcast, it's WADA, weighted average daily attendance, is what drives our funding. And so we have less weighted students based on our demographics. We have less students that are economically disadvantaged or receiving special ed services, et cetera. So part of it, I understand that we should fund those kids more that have greater needs. But part of it is just the inequity of the school finance formulas that the state uses, that the same kid in our district with the same demographics that goes to another district is suddenly qualifies for more funding. And that part I really struggle with, that I think the same kid in different districts should qualify for the same amount of funding. And that's part of it. I hope the legislature will address at some point.
I mean, that is so hard. I was a trustee for 10 years, and I thought every time I thought I would get a little further along in understanding the finance, I would just sometimes I don't think there are very many people who understand it in the state.
It is complicated.
Honestly.
There's a
it's
huge
very
template.
complicated.
All the formulas that drive in. Yes, yeah,
it is very complicated.
So right now, security is becoming, it is a big issue right now in public ed, and I imagine there's funding associated with that. Would the funding for those sort of initiatives pull from the teacher salary, the money that would typically go to the teacher salary increases, or how does that work?
So, that's a great question. These are competing priorities for us. And so, the more money we put into one initiative, such as security, is going to have to take away from another initiative. The one thing we do have going for us is that we are a growing district. So every year we grow about 100 kids, which does provide more funding. But with more students, then of course we have to hire more teachers, for more classrooms for those kids as well. But yes, if it does sound like the legislature is going to provide, and the state's going to provide some additional funding specific to school safety and security, which will be helpful. And so we'll certainly use that money for that. But if we want to do additional initiatives for school safety, that would come out of competing priorities for our budget.
Got it. No, very, very good. And then of course vouchers, right? That's a hot topic right now.
It is.
I know when Arizona passed some legislation around that. I mean, how would that affect funding if
vouchers? My concern with vouchers is how it would affect the statewide budget. The immediate concern, the short-term concern for vouchers is that you could lose kids that choose to go to a private school. Then by losing kids, you lose weighted average daily attendance. So that really impacts your budget. Honestly, I'm not as worried about that for my district because again, we're already a growing district. But my concern is how vouchers would affect the statewide budget. Because if they're going to start funding kids at private schools that they're not funding now, that's additional drain on the overall state budget that in the long term will affect us. There'll be less money for public schools then because they're now funding for private schools. And so if they're only going to fund students that are currently in public schools that are economically disadvantaged, that can't afford to pay for private school tuition, that would be okay from a budgetary standpoint for the state. But they're going to start now paying for vouchers for kids that are already at private schools or that aren't economically disadvantaged, that now it's additional kids that the state has to fund. That's really going to become a burden on the state budget and affect our long-term funding for public schools as well.
I think my concern with vouchers goes back to my district was really small where I served, and school choice and vouchers, those things seem so far away. Like people oh, there really aren't any other options. It's 45 minutes to a private school. And so it seems like, oh, this isn't really a big deal. But when you think of the entire state and what it's going to do to the budget, it is a big deal.
Right.
And then who would it help? What kind of student would it help in my small rural district? It's not going to help the student who's economically disadvantaged. That parent is not going to be able to. So it's who is it helping? I wish that more people would understand. It doesn't mean that we don't want to help students. We're not saying we don't want to help students, but what kind of student will be helped?
That's a great point. And that's a few sessions ago, they had a bill that was going to allow vouchers for kids that were not economically disadvantaged, that, families that made, 6-digit salaries and family incomes. And that's the issue of if we're only funding kids that are economically disadvantaged, that truly can't afford private school tuition, that would be okay. And if we're only doing it to go to a private school that then would have to accept the tuition amount based on the voucher, because the other issue is, some private schools run $15,000, $20,000 a year. Well, again, my per student funding for my district is $8,900. So if you have a voucher of that much, how are they going to afford the difference? So my proposal that if they ever do vouchers, it should be for only kids that are truly demonstrate financial need. Number one. Number two, they would have to, the private school that takes them would have to accept whatever that voucher amount is, even if it's a private school that normally charges $20,000 a year. They need to take that voucher, because otherwise the economic disadvantaged family won't be able to afford the difference in tuition anyway. Number two. Number three, they should have a zero reject policy that if a private school chooses to take these kids, they should take them all just like public schools do, because otherwise, again, if they're picking and choosing kids in their admission policy, the kids that need it aren't going to get in anyway. Number three. And number four is then there should be some accountability tied to it, that those kids should be subject to the same state tests, financial accountability, academic accountability that public schools are too. Otherwise, the state could be spending billions of dollars for vouchers, and we would have no idea how successful those vouchers are, for those kids in those private schools. So those are the four criteria I would put in place if the state ever does vouchers is again, zero reject, only kids in financial need. The voucher should be the limit on what the private school charges for tuition. And again, some kind of accountability, just like the STAR test and academic and financial accountability public schools have. So there's my soapbox on vouchers.
Yeah, I love those 4 points, because I think those 4 points help districts like mine, small districts, or very rural districts where there are not options for other schools. I mean, and then I guess the homeschool piece could come, then the parents who want to homeschool then could have that. But I think that's another piece. True homeschoolers, parents who are the diehard purists in homeschool don't truly want the state's money, because they don't want the state's requirements. If the tax dollars and that money would also have the requirements that it should. So I'm speaking from a former homeschool. I was a homeschool mom for a long time, and I can tell you that I never once thought, gee, I wish I had the tax dollars for my homeschool kids. You just don't think that way. And again, I would go back to privilege. Who gets to homeschool, right? Like that meant that I wasn't working. And so I think that we really should think about equity when it comes to, if we're really talking about equity and following vouchers, then it doesn't hold up. It really doesn't. But I know we want to, we always run short on time on our podcast. We always think about having other people come back. I want to know, sometimes Gary throws me the last question. I'm going to ask a question, then Gary can ask the last one this time. Is that okay?
It sounds good.
What is your big ask? I know we talked about like funding, but what's your big ask and your big dream for public ed as we start a new year? And the big dream, like, probably for those and they're making policy, but then for you, a personal one for your district.
For me, it is truly back to funding. There's my top five priorities would be funding, and funding, because by that, getting more equity with other districts and being able to compensate teachers to stay in the profession and treat them with respect and that would be my number one, is if we can get more funding to take care of our kids adequately. And so I really do hope the legislature is able to do something for this. But yeah, I think that the key is taking care of our employees from a financial standpoint, from an appreciation, respect standpoint, and support. And then if we do that, they take care of our kids and do a great job educating them. So that would be my top priority for sure.
Love it. Okay, my question's mine's an easy one. Okay, this is going to be kind of like the ice bucket challenge a little bit, or something. There's all kinds of challenges out there.
Sure.
Who do you know that's passionate about public education? Could be a board member, could be a superintendent, could be anybody in public ed. Who would you want to give a shout out to come on the podcast and share their story?
I would say Bobby Ott, superintendent in Temple ISD, because he was just recently named the superintendent of the year for the entire state of Texas. And he's my neighbor to the north here in Bell County as well. So that'd be, if I had to do an ice bucket challenge, it's to Bobby Ott in Temple.
That's funny. He's on right after you.
So then he can't, you have to pick a different one, sir.
Okay. How about Dr. Matt Smith, the superintendent in Belton?
Got it. Okay.
He's also our neighbor here in Bell County. He's another great, we've got a group of great superintendents here in Bell County. those two are certainly two of them as well. So
that is so great. I love it. I don't think that's ever happened before. That we have.
And I did not know that. That was not planned. I didn't know
we
what
did.
was going on next. So
I know. Sometimes I know all the guests, and sometimes he picks. So it's like, what a beautiful way to end this. That you have a shout out to the person that we have coming on next, and it has been so delightful to get to spend some time. Your district is blessed to have you. I wish you a wonderful, wonderful holiday break, and hope you take care of you. I know you're trying really hard to take care of your district and students in your area, and we can see that and hear that through your passion. And so thank you so much for being on with us today.
Thank you for your support of public education.
Yes, absolutely. So excited to have you on today. And before we close out, just want to give a last shout out to our sponsor, Ideal Impact. Ideal Impact providing hundreds of millions of dollars in funding to school districts and around Texas. And it doesn't involve any taxpayer dollars, doesn't involve any dollars out of pocket. It's actually in the form of a free gift. So it's really cool. So thank you for our sponsor. And for those of y'all who have been tuning in, stay tuned for future episodes of the Educational Leadership Podcast.